Chapter 4, which is also on population, is titled Population Growth and Decline. So again, this unit includes Chapter 3 and Chapter 4, which are both on population, and also Chapter 5, which will be on migration. Before the 19th century, the total human population grew very, very slowly over a long time. As you can see here, we didn't reach 1 billion people until 1804, and today we're well over 7 billion. So we've seen an exponential growth in population since the year 1800. By making small improvements in farming techniques, clearing forested land to expand land for crops, and finding new regions of the ocean dense in fish, people became more efficient at extracting energy from the environment. All of that plus more technological innovations we call the Industrial Revolution. And that's the reason why around 1800 we start to see this rapid increase in population. In the 200 years since the Industrial Revolution, the world population has exploded. It's around 7.4 billion today. The United Nations predicts it will reach nearly 11 billion by 2100. Take a second and watch this video clip. Measuring the number of births. Geographers commonly use two different statistics to describe the rate at which children are born. The crude birth rate, or CBR, is the number of live births per year for every 1,000 people. So again, crude birth rate, number of live births per 1,000 people. The second statistic we look at is called total fertility rates, and TFR focuses on women in their childbearing ages, which is from 15 to 49. And so TFR tells us the number of births per woman. So for example, you can see from this map of total fertility rates, we see that in places like North America and Europe and Australia, the average woman only has 1 to 2 children, whereas many places in Sub-Saharan Africa, we can see that women are still averaging 6, 7, even 8 children per woman. So TFR again is the average number of children who would be born per woman of that group in a country, assuming every woman lived through her childbearing years. So you have to make sure you pay attention. Is the question asking me about crude birth rates, or is this asking me about total fertility rates? Because a crude birth rate of 7 would actually be very low. It would mean that there's only 7 births per 1,000 people in that society, whereas a TFR of 7 would be very high. That would mean that the average woman is having 7 children. So compared to crude birth rates, the TFR more accurately reflects cultural norms, such as how people weigh the costs and benefits of having a child and how people perceive the role of women in society. We see that in more developed countries, TFR and crude birth rates are going to be much lower than in less developed countries. Women in developed countries tend to choose to have far less children because of jobs and money and things like that. So all of that plays a big role. And we can see here in this chart of the US that over time the average woman in the US has decreased their TFR. So around 1800 the average woman had more than 6 children in the US, and today it's actually less than 2. Same was true in parts of Europe before 1800. Women were still averaging above 6 children. Today, again, in most European countries, it's even below 2 children. One reason why in the US and in Europe before 1800 women had lots of children is because most people lived on farms, and having more children meant more people to work the land. So having children was economically advantageous during those time periods, which is still true in many less developed countries today where people are still working in agriculture. Another reason why TFR was high prior to 1800 is because many children died as infants, and people only lived on average about 40 years. So many people would have more children than they even necessarily wanted because they knew that they were going to lose some of them. Despite the high TFR, population growth was slow. Take a second and watch this video. Changes in fertility. Beginning in the mid-18th century, Europeans began having fewer children. Part of this was unintentional. During this time, countries began keeping larger standing armies, so more men were away from home for longer periods. But part of this was intentional. With the Industrial Revolution, when people began to rely more on machines than on muscle power to produce goods, couples decided they needed fewer children. But industrialization also enabled people to live longer. So even though TFR declined, population growth increased in these European countries. Cultural, economic, political, and environmental realities have always shaped decisions about whether to have children. As Harriet Beecher Stowe said, women are the real architects of society. Since these conditions have varied across time and cultures, so have birth rates. How people viewed the role of women in a society has been a particularly important factor in influencing TFR. Over the past 250 years, as countries industrialized, people moved from rural areas to urban areas and found work in factories. Many women became factory workers or domestic help. They lived in small apartments or small houses in cities, and families, therefore, became smaller. Urban families did not need children to work the farmland, and they were living in already crowded spaces. But in the latter part of the century, governments passed laws prohibiting child labor and began opening public schools. As young women obtained more schooling, they began to expand their work opportunities. The longer they stayed in school, the fewer children they had, a trend that continues to the present day. One reason for this is because while you're in school, many women don't choose to get pregnant during that time. So the longer you stay in school, the longer you're prolonging that first pregnancy, which then cuts down on the amount of years you're able to have children. Let's take a second and look at the West African country of Ghana. West Africa is the largest population in all of Africa. In Ghana, between 1990 and 2007, as young women gained more education, the number of children they had decreased. The government there promoted this. When governments promote women having less children, these are known as anti-natalist population policies. And this suggests that young women who spent more time in school chose to delay marriage and therefore also chose to delay having children. Take a second and watch this video. The United States showed a similar pattern of delayed marriage. As educational opportunities increased for women between 1950 and 2010, the median marriage age of women increased from just over 20 years of age to nearly 27. The average age at which women gave birth to their first child increased as well. This delay in marriage gave women a shorter time period during which they are able to have children. Family planning. Throughout the 20th century, the spread of family planning information and changes in technology aided people who wanted to choose the number of children they had. In countries with wide access to family planning methods, including the United States and many countries in Europe, couples gave birth to their first child later in life, had fewer children, had fewer unintended pregnancies, and had larger intervals between having children. So when we're talking about access to family planning services, a big portion of that is contraceptives, and that includes the pill, condoms, all of those different ways that we're able to prevent having children. In these places, the total fertility rate continued a decline that began with the Industrial Revolution. Religious values also shape attitudes towards having children. There are some religions or even denominations within religions where they do still have lots of children. But even across the board, we have seen a decline in total fertility rates no matter what the religion. Some religious traditions oppose certain forms of family planning, and if they oppose certain types of contraceptives, then you're typically going to see a larger family size. Women who follow traditional religious beliefs, regardless of their particular religion, have higher fertility rates than those who do not. These women are less likely to use birth control and less likely to be employed outside of the home due to those traditional values. Governments also influence the TFR. Concerns about overpopulation, the growth of population beyond what an area can support, has led to anti-natalist policies. These are programs to decrease the number of births. China's one-child policy is the most famous anti-natalist policy. The Chinese government introduced two different anti-natalist policies in the 1970s. The first, known as Later, Longer, Fewer, was introduced in 1972. The impact of the Later, Longer, Fewer policy can be seen in China's pyramid in the relatively shorter bars for the 40 to 44 and 35 to 39-year-old cohorts. The expansion in births in the 25 to 29 and 30 to 34 cohorts is the result of the large number of women who entered childbearing age in the mid-1980s. Later, Longer, Fewer did result in reduced fertility, but not as quickly as officials wanted. In response, China instituted its one-child policy in 1979. Because of this policy, China is starting to see some of the unintended consequences. That is that they're going to have a much larger elderly population and not enough working age people to support those elderly. Take a second and watch this video. Parents who had more than one child were subject to fines, although the law made exceptions for rural couples and ethnic minorities. Take a second and watch this video. So again, while China's one-child policy did solve the issue of a rapidly growing population, it has caused a lot of unintended consequences. One, we said, is a larger elderly population than working age population. Another is that what we found was that when couples could only have one child, they preferred to have a boy child. And so we are seeing millions more boys in China today than girls. So now we have an out-of-sync sex ratio in China. So again, under the one-child policy, this only applied to the Han Chinese, which are the majority ethnic group. The Han Chinese are an East Asian ethnic group, mainly found in China, but also have migrated to other places, including Singapore and other places in Southeast Asia. The Han Chinese constitute the world's largest ethnic group, making up 18% of the global population. The one-child policy remained in effect from 1979 until 2016, and because of the unintended consequences and also because of China's rapid development, they have relaxed the policy. During that time, though, we've seen China's fertility rate decrease significantly, and it was one of the fastest decreases the world's ever seen. However, researchers disagree on how much of the decline resulted from the policy and how much was from other factors, such as increased education for women. One effect of China's one-child policy was that it reduced the number of adult workers in the country. Concerns that a smaller workforce would reduce economic growth and would lead to a shortage of workers to support the elderly led the government to reevaluate the policy. We can see from this political cartoon that when you have fewer children, that means that the personal responsibility on those children ends up being greater because they have to care for both sets of their parents. In addition, we said the policy has also contributed to an unbalanced gender ratio, where there's a lot more males than females today. Chinese culture has long preferred male children over females, and one reason is because the oldest male is going to take care of the parents in old age. So when some couples learned that their one child would be a girl, they either chose to have an abortion or gave the baby up for adoption. By doing this, they could have another child who might be male. By 2010, China had 118 males born for every 100 females. The gender imbalance was so great that Chinese leaders feared it would lead to greater crime and civil unrest among young men who felt they had no prospects to get married and have children. So in 2016, the Chinese government modified the controversial program and now allows families to have 2 children. While China's one-child policy was the most comprehensive population control plan, other countries have used more targeted programs. In European nations, birth control education decreased teenage pregnancy. In Africa and South Asia, laws banning child marriage raised the average marriage age and the age that a woman has her first child. On the flip side, we have some governments with policies that try to encourage births. Throughout history, some governments have encouraged large families. Governments have believed that a growing population stimulated economic growth and increased military power. In recent decades, a variation of this reasoning has emerged in some highly developed countries, like Japan. As fertility rates dropped but people lived longer, the percentage of elderly people has increased. And in fact, in Japan, their birth rate is so low, the average woman has less than 2 children, that adult diapers are sold more than baby diapers. Take a second and watch this video. These policies to try to encourage births is, again, happening in highly developed countries where women today are choosing to have less than 2 children. These are called pro-natalist policies, and a good example is from France. So to keep the economy vibrant, countries such as France, Sweden, and Japan have instituted these pro-natalist policies, or programs designed to increase the fertility rate. Some of these programs included paid time off from jobs held by mothers, also known as maternity leave, free childcare so that the cost of having children and a job wouldn't be a hurdle in having children, family discounts for government services, extended maternity leave, which is now 50 weeks in Canada, 58 weeks in Japan, and 90 weeks in Norway. Family-friendly workplaces, including worksite nurseries, and even free college tuition in many of these countries. Also, some restrictions on birth control and abortions. However, even with all of these perks to having more children, we are starting to see that it was a lot easier to lower birth rates than it has been to increase them. Life expectancy. Even though the total fertility rate worldwide has been decreasing, the world's population continues to grow. This growth reflects a decrease in the death rate and an increase in how long people live. Global population increase. The most important factor in the global increase is life expectancy, which is the number of years the average person will live. Life expectancy is commonly expressed from the time of a person's birth, but it can be calculated at any point in his or her lifetime. And we see different countries have different life expectancies. Japan being the oldest at the average person living to be 82.1 years of age. A century ago, the global life expectancy was about 34 years at birth. Today, the global life expectancy is nearly 70. In most of Europe, life expectancy at birth is more than 80 years. However, in less developed areas, such as many sub-Saharan African countries, life expectancy at birth is less than 50 years. The average life expectancy in Africa is 47. So an African is bound to live almost just half the life of a Western European. One of the most important factors increasing life expectancy is the drop in the infant mortality rate, the number of children who die before their first birthday. For example, in the state of Massachusetts, the infant mortality rate decreased from 130 out of each 1,000 live births in the 1850s to about only 4 today. Better food production and nutrition. Over the past 250 years, several advances in agriculture have helped increase life expectancy, including mechanizing food production, such as replacing horses with tractors, improving seeds, fertilizers, and farming techniques through research by state universities and private companies, transporting products more efficiently in trucks, trains, and ships, often on roads, rail lines, or canals built with government support. In the United States in 1800, almost everyone farmed. Today, however, farmers make up less than 3% of the population, yet they produce enough food to feed everyone in the country and export vast quantities. Advances in agriculture such as the following had effects that rippled through society. Greater farming efficiency freed people to work in non-farm industries, easing the transition to industrialization. food security improved around the world. Hunger and famine still occurred because people were too poor to purchase food or because of political or distribution problems, but not because of an actual food shortage. Second, watch this video. As farms depended less on manual labor, farm families became smaller. The use of machinery meant that one person could farm more acres. Many small farms were consolidated into larger farms, and the owners of those consolidated farms moved to urban areas, so a lot less farmers. As the population of rural areas decreased and cars and better roads allowed people to travel farther and more easily, many small towns that had served farmers disappeared. And as we learned in Unit 1, these are known as ghost towns. Advances in public sanitation. As early industrial cities grew, so did the problems of large concentrated populations, such as the spread of cholera, which is a disease transferred through water, and other diseases through water contamination by human waste, as well as plague, which carried by fleas that lived on rodents. One of the most important advances in reducing mortality was the creation of public sewer systems. Before the Industrial Revolution and in its early years, people in cities dumped human waste into streets and rivers. The waste often reached the water supply, contaminating the water and making people sick. Especially vulnerable to disease were children and elderly. Then cities began to install sewer systems, protecting water supplies from contamination and thus increasing life expectancy. People also learned that boiling water before they used it could prevent transmission of waterborne illnesses. That worked before citizens decided to pay for clean water through taxes. Communities began to install water treatment plants that transported clean water to the homes in the cities. Cities also created departments of public sanitation and started to collect garbage and other waste produced by city residents. By doing this, cities reduced the number of rodents that fed on the waste and often carried disease. Improvements in healthcare. Improved medical care coincided with improvements in food production and sanitation. And again, all of this is part of what we call the Industrial Revolution. The development of vaccines to prevent disease, antibiotics to cure disease, and improved medical procedures boosted life expectancy. Prior to the 1800s, smallpox killed as many as 400,000 people each year. However, in the 1700s, Dr. Edward Jenner figured out that if he infected people with cowpox, a much milder disease related to smallpox, those people would be immune to smallpox, and this was the beginning of vaccines. Jenner's work led to a smallpox vaccine. And today, because of the efforts of the UN, national governments, and private organizations to vaccinate people around the world, have been so successful that no case of smallpox has been reported since 1977. So thanks to vaccination, we have seen smallpox be eradicated. Jenner's work also is the basis for vaccines against other serious diseases, such as polio, tuberculosis, and rabies. While vaccines helped prevent people from getting ill, antibiotics helped cure people who had bacterial infections. The first widely used antibiotic was penicillin, which came into use in the mid-1900s. Before penicillin, deadly bacterial infections killed many people. The deadliest epidemic in history was the plague, which was spread by flea bites. During the mid-1300s, the bubonic plague killed about 20 million people just in Europe. Other common bacterial infections include staph, which commonly killed people who got wounded in battle or suffered a deep cut, strep, and parasitic infections. Improved medical procedures have also extended life expectancy. Among these procedures was the development and improvement of surgery, which was often deadly before antibiotics. Now surgery is safe enough that it can help an individual suffering from a heart attack, stroke, cancer, or other ailments. One of the most important things that you need to learn from Unit 2 is the demographic transition model. Now, demography is the study of population. So the demographic transition is going to be about changes that happen within a population. Take a second and watch this video. Changes in the birth and death rate in a country are shaped by how a country changes from an agrarian, which means a farming, to an industrial society. The demographic transition model shows 5 typical stages of population change that countries pass through as they modernize. So stage 1 would be that early agrarian before the Industrial Revolution. Stage 5 would be highly developed countries. The demographic transition model is based on an interpretation began in 1929 by an American demographer, Warren Thompson, of the observed changes or transitions in birth and death rates in industrialized societies over the past 200 years or so. There are things the demographic transition model cannot reveal. The impact of other demographic variables, such as migration, are not considered, nor does the model predict how long a country will be in each stage. But even so, the relationship between birth rate and death rate is an important concept when discussing population and any pattern. The demographic transition model and population pyramids. So if you guys remember, we learned about population pyramids in Chapter 3. And what's cool is those shapes of population pyramids can actually tell us what stage in the demographic transition a country is in. So the first stage of the DTM is characterized by a very high birth rate, but fluctuating as need for farm labor changes. We also see a high death rate, but fluctuating to reflect diseases and poor sanitation. So in stage 1, we see high birth rates and high death rates. So again, because there's high birth rates and high death rates, we see very low growth because births and deaths are both high. So if the average woman has 6 children, but 4 of those children die, then population remains the same because the 2 surviving children replace the parents, and therefore population doesn't change. There are no countries that are still in stage 1. Everybody has moved out of stage 1. There are scattered, isolated groups in some of the least developed regions of Africa, like war-torn regions of Sudan, Angola, and even Afghanistan, but there's no countries that are in stage 1. So if you were asked on a test, like an FRQ question, to give examples of countries in each of the stages, you would just say there are no countries in stage 1 of the demographic transition. Every country, though, was in stage 1 prior to the Industrial Revolution. And when countries were in stage 1, you would have a very young population structure. People don't live to be old, and you have lots of children. Moving on to stage 2 of the demographic transition. We're still going to have high birth rates in stage 2. However, the change in stage 2 is that your death rate starts to decline. So rapid decline as nutrition, sanitation, and medicine all improve. So again, stage 2 is going to have high birth rates and lowering death rates. So now women may still be having 6 children, but now maybe 5 of those children are surviving, which means we're going to have rapid population growth as we have high birth rates and low death rates. All countries have gone through stage 2, and when a country's in stage 2, this is what their population pyramid is going to look like. It's going to be a traditional pyramid shape. We can see each new generation is getting significantly larger than the last, and that shows us a rapidly growing population. Today, most of the stage 2 countries are found in sub-Saharan Africa, Mali and Sudan both being examples of stage 2, as we can see by the shapes of their population pyramids. Outside of sub-Saharan Africa, another good example for a stage 2 country would be Afghanistan. In stage 2, your population structure is also very young, meaning that the most of your population are those younger age groups. Stage 3 of the demographic transition model. Stage 3 is when we start to see the birth rate come down because of urbanization and the decrease for child labor. The death rate's also continuing to decline from stage 2, but not as fast as it was in stage 2. So overall, we still see population growing in stage 3, but it's not as rapid of a growth as stage 2 was because that birth rate is starting to come down. So now instead of having 6 children, a woman might have 3 children. And 3 children, because it's above that 2 replacement rate, is going to cause moderate growth. Countries like Mexico and India would be good examples of stage 3. A stage 3 pyramid is going to look like this. I call this kind of a fat pyramid shape. We are starting to see those younger cohorts start to come down. That's because the birth rate is slowing. So it's going to look like this fatter shaped pyramid. So again, some good examples of stage 3 countries would be Mexico, Turkey, Indonesia, India, Bangladesh. All of these countries still see slight population growth taking place, but it's not as rapid as it once was. So you're going to still have a relatively young population structure, though not as young as in stage 1 or 2, with rising life expectancy. So you're starting to see more people in those older age groups. Stage 4 of the demographic transition, we're going to see low birth rates, but enough to keep a population stable, meaning the average woman is having 2 children. See a low and stable death rate, which means, again, the average woman has 2 children and those 2 children survive, meaning that there's going to be very little population change. The United States is a good example of a stage 4 country. Very low growth because births and deaths are both low. So countries that look kind of more rectangular throughout are going to be a stage 4 pyramid. So both stage 1 and stage 4 have very low growth for very different reasons. Stage 1 population isn't growing, but it's because the death rate is so high. Stage 4, the population isn't growing because people are having very few births and very few deaths. So the examples of a stage 4 country are kind of our more developed countries like the United States, like most of the Western European countries, and also China today. But China's is kind of not a natural progression that took place. We already talked earlier about China's one-child policy. So overall, we see a more balanced population structure, which is what gives us that more rectangular shape of the population pyramid, but with more and more older adults, more aging people. All right, stage 5 of the demographic transition. We see birth rates that are so low that it actually falls below the death rate, meaning there are more deaths in a country than births, so we're going to actually see a declining population. So in stage 5, we would see that the TFR is below 2 children. So the average woman is having less than 2 children. We also are going to see a low death rates because these are the most developed countries in the world with the best health care. But we may see a slight increase in death rates simply because you have a higher elderly population and old people do eventually die. Japan is a country that is in stage 5. They have more deaths than births. Their population is declining, and we can see that in their population pyramid. We see each new cohort is getting smaller, which means there's fewer and fewer children being born. And we can see that there's a lot less youth than there are elderly people. Germany is also another country that is in stage 5, as well as Russia. And again, we can see that with this kind of inverted pyramid shape. So overall population change here, this is the only stage where we're going to see population actually decrease. So Japan, Germany, and Russia would be your best examples for stage 5. Your population structure here is going to be old. The majority of your population are going to be older adults. Stage 2 to 5 of the demographic transition model each tend to produce a different shaped population pyramid. The least developed country in the world is Niger, which is found in West Africa. So because of that, they are in stage 2 of the demographic transition model. Let's take a look at what their population pyramid looks like. The average woman in Niger now has 8 children, and most of those children today survive because of what is known as the medical revolution, where we have given vaccines and medical care to these less developed countries. So we see more and more children, and that's reflected in this population pyramid. Each generation is getting significantly larger than the last, and their population is growing very rapidly because of it. So Niger represents a stage 2 country with an expansive population pyramid, one with a very high birth rate, which is what produces that wide base, and a low life expectancy, which leads to the narrowing in the upper years. Because the younger generations are larger than the older ones, the result is rapid population growth. This is typical of less developed regions and countries. Now let's take a look at the country of Turkey. Turkey represents a stage 3 nation, meaning their population is still growing, but only moderately growing. Women have started to choose to have fewer children. So now the average woman, or the average TFR, is only about 3 to 4 kids. So Turkey represents an urbanizing stage 3 nation with a declining birth rate. Notice that the majority of the population is under the age of 34, so still a relatively young country. The society is still young, but the percentage of elderly is increasing as life expectancy goes up. Now let's take a look at the Western European country of France. France's pyramid represents stage 4. It is typical of a shape known as a stationary population pyramid. Each generation we can see is pretty much the same as the last, meaning population isn't really growing or decreasing. So again, that indicates a population that is not significantly growing or shrinking. The birth rate is low but steady. The average woman has 2 children. Those 2 children replace the 2 parents when they die. Population remains the same. The death rate is also low, indicating a high life expectancy and increased percentage of older people. This graph shape is usually associated with more developed countries. Japan, which is a highly developed country though, has actually moved again to stage 5. What we see in Japan is that because women are in the workplace, because they live in urban areas, because having children is expensive, we see the average woman in Japan actually has less than 2 children. So what we see is an increasing elderly population and a decreasing younger population. So Japan's pyramid represents stage 5. The narrow base reflects a decreasing birth rate. The population is aging and declining slightly overall. The largest age group is 65 to 69. As countries move from stage to stage, they face different challenges. A country that's in stage 2 or 3 with a relatively high percentage of young people often lacks the resources to educate all children. A country in stage 4 or 5 with a relatively high percentage of old people often faces problems funding healthcare. However, since the elderly can vote while children cannot, the elderly often have more influence on governmental policy than do children. So take a second and watch the video again. So hopefully now you understand why different shape population pyramids coincide with different stages of the demographic transition model. Rate of population increase. The natural increase or decrease in a population is measured by subtracting the number of deaths from the number of births. To compare countries of different sizes, demographers use rates rather than total numbers. The crude birth rate and the crude death rate of an area are measured per 1,000 population. The percentage at what a population is growing or declining without the impact of migration is known as the rate of natural increase. So what we see, and I want you guys to pay attention to this map really quickly, is the countries that have the fastest growth rates are only around 2%, all right? So 2% is high. That's a very high growth rate. What you really want is your country to be closer to 0, so population is not growing. That's stage 4, all right? So that's really kind of where we want. So don't see the number 2 and think that's low. 2 is actually a very high natural increase rate. So the way that the rate of natural increase is calculated is crude birth rate minus crude death rate divided by 10, and that's your percentage growth. For the entire world, the crude birth rate is about 20, meaning 20 births per 1,000, and crude death rate is about 8, meaning 8 deaths per 1,000. Which tells us the rate of natural increase for the world is about 1.2%, which again may sound small, but when you're talking about 1.2% of over 7 billion people, we're talking about a lot of new people added to the population every year. So rate of natural increase tends to be less than 1% in the developed countries and greater than 1% in less developed countries, which means today basically all of the population growth that is happening in less developed countries. The demographic balancing equation. Natural increase is only part of a country's total population change. Migration also plays a part. To calculate a country's total population change, the number of immigrants, people who moved into the country, and the number of immigrants, people who moved out of the country, must be added to the equation. This is known as the demographic balancing equation. So how we truly find the population change in a country is by looking not only internally at the births and deaths, but also looking at migration. So you have to do births minus deaths plus or minus the amount of in or out migration. Population doubling time. Demographers describe population growth in two ways. Arithmetic growth is when the increase is constant number each period. Arithmetic growth by the addition of 1 would be 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. Arithmetic growth by 5 would be 1, 6, 11, 16, etc. Exponential growth is when the increase is a constant factor each period. If the factor is 2, then the number doubles each period, 1, 2, 4, 8, etc. Exponential growth by 5 would be 1, 5, 25, 125, etc. Since the early 1800s with the Industrial Revolution, global population has been growing exponentially. The time period required for a population experiencing exponential growth to double in size completely, given the rate of natural increase is constant, is called doubling time. For any quantity growing exponentially, the time it takes to double in size can be estimated using an equation known as the rule of 70. Assuming the growth rate remains steady, the approximate doubling time in years will be 70 divided by the growth rate per year. So if you have a 1% natural increase, it's going to take you 70 years for your population to double in size. So if we have a natural increase rate of 5%, then that would mean that your doubling time would only be about 14 years. At 7%, only about 10 years. Let's look quickly at the West African country of Ivory Coast, also known as Côte d'Ivoire. In 2014, the Ivory Coast had a population growth rate of about 2%. Since 70 divided by 2 equals 35, if the growth rate remains about 2%, the population of Ivory Coast will double in 35 years. The United States has a much lower growth rate at only 0.77. That means if our current growth rate remains, the US population will double in about 91 years. The second model we're going to learn about this unit, and very important, is known as the epidemiological transition model. We said the demographic transition is all about population because demography is the study of population. The epidemiologic transition is going to be all about disease because epidemiology is the study of disease. Because the world did not develop industrially and economically at the same pace in all areas, there's a large discrepancy in the types of diseases found across the world. In the early 1970s, epidemiologist Abdel Omran identified predictable stages in disease and life expectancy that countries experience as they develop. The epidemiological transition accounts for the replacement of infectious diseases by chronic diseases over time due to expanded public health and sanitation. These stages go hand in hand with the demographic transition model. We see very different types of diseases affect different countries depending on their level of development. All of this is shown through Omran's work, is known as the epidemiological transition model. And again, these stages of the epidemiologic transition correspond with the stages of the demographic transition. So when countries are in stage 1 of the DTM, they have certain type of diseases. When they're in stage 5 of the DTM, they have certain type of diseases. Omran divided the epidemiological transition of mortality into 3 phases, and the last of which chronic disease replaces infection as the primary cause of death. Stage 1 is known as the age of pestilence and famine. Mortality is high and fluctuating, precluding sustained population growth with low and variable life expectancy. We see that life expectancy is usually between 20 and 40 years in stage 1. When countries are in this stage, we see an increase in infectious diseases, malnutrition, and famine. Omran's first phase occurs when human population sustains cyclic, low growth, and mostly linear up and down patterns associated with wars, famine, and epidemic outbreaks. So again, this pestilence and famine goes hand in hand with stage 1 of the demographic transition model, where we have low population growth rates because we have high birth and high death rates. Stage 2 is known as the age of receding pandemics. So just like in stage 2 of the demographic transition, we see mortality or death rates decline, with the rate of declining accelerating as epidemic peaks decrease in frequency. Average life expectancy increases steadily from about 30 to 50 years. Population growth is sustained and begins to be exponential. The second phase involves improved nutrition as a result of stable food production, along with advances in medicine and the development of healthcare systems. So just like the demographic transition model, it's the Industrial Revolution that first pushes countries into this second phase. Mortality in Western Europe and North America was halved during the 19th century due to closed sewer systems and clean water provided by public utilities. The age of degenerative and man-made diseases, stage 3. So just like the demographic transition model, we see mortality continue to decline and eventually starts to get close to stable. So we're not seeing those infectious and parasitic diseases anymore. Instead, we're starting to see those degenerative diseases, the things that you get when you're older, things like cardiovascular disease, many types of cancer, but also accidents, substance abuse, these types of things. Some of these are actually what I call luxury diseases. We give them to ourselves. It's because of human behavior patterns like smoking and drinking and things like that. The average life expectancy at birth during the third phase rises gradually until it exceeds 50 years. Omran's third phase occurs when human birth rates drastically decline from higher positive replacement rates to stable replacement numbers. Replacement rates or replacement level is the number of children per woman that will supply just enough births to replace parents and compensate for early deaths with no allowance for migration effects. And that perfect number in terms of TFR is 2.1. Now, obviously, nobody can have 0.1 of a child. What that means is we need most women to have 2 children and some women to have more than 2 children. The ideas of Thomas Malthus. In 1798, Thomas Malthus published one of the most provocative books on population growth ever written, an essay on the principle of population. Malthus, a member of the clergy and early economist, focused on one of the underlying concerns of geography, the relationship between people and the earth. Malthus, it's important to note, lived during the late early 1800s when the Industrial Revolution was first happening in the first country it happened to, which is the UK or England. And Malthus lived during a period when people were optimistic that new technology would make life better, but Malthus feared it would not. He analyzed the relationship between agricultural output and the growing number of people, and concluded that society was on a path towards massive starvation. He believed that food production would increase arithmetically, growing steadily, but by the same amount each generation. In contrast, he believed that people would not limit the number of children they had, so the population would increase exponentially, multiplying by the same amount each generation. Since population would grow faster than food supply, the world's population would soon be unsupportable. If people could not limit population growth voluntarily, widespread and massive starvation would occur. In a global sense, Thomas Malthus's predictions have not come true. We have been able to grow our food supply exponentially with our population. Now, if you look at certain regions, though, you could say that Malthus's theory has come true. Places like the Horn of Africa and places where population is growing fast and they don't have enough food, you could definitely apply it. There are people, though, that actually say that Thomas Malthus's theory just hasn't happened yet. We haven't reached that point of crisis yet, but that we may before we hit that 11 billion by the end of the next century. Geographers and other social scientists have debated the usefulness of Malthus's ideas about population growth, known as Malthusian theory, since he first published them. Food production grew more quickly than Malthus predicted, so famine did not reach the scale he feared. People today who have adapted his basic ideas to modern condition are known as neo-Malthusians, and the prefix neo just means new. They argue that global overpopulation is a serious problem and an even greater threat for the future. They point out continued population growth will lead to the depletion of non-renewable resources such as petroleum and metals, pollution of air and water, shortages of food, all of which could bring social, political, economic, and environmental collapse. On the flip side of Malthus's theory is something known as the Bostrup hypothesis, created by Esther Bostrup. The Bostrup hypothesis is a much more optimistic approach, and she wrote it in The Conditions of Agricultural Growth in 1965. She claims that people have the resources of knowledge and technology to increase food supply as necessary, that as our population continues to grow from 7 to 11 billion, we're going to continue to invent new technology that makes it possible for us to grow enough food to support 11 billion. She claims that necessity is the mother of invention and that this pressure is actually what causes us to invent these new technologies. Bostrup is known for her theory of agricultural intensification, also known as Quay's theory, which posits that population change drives the intensity of agricultural production. So instead of seeing food supply go below total population, we're going to increase food supply with new technology. Bostrup's theory is different than the Malthusian theory due to the increased amount of technological advancements. Thomas Malthus would have never dreamed of the type of technology we use in agriculture today. Unlike Malthus, Bostrup believed that an increase in population would stimulate technologists to increase food production. This is the opposite of what Malthus believed because during her time, the farming technology had drastically risen and food supply was not the main concern for human population. And again, the base of Bostrup's theory is necessity is the mother of invention. In support of this view are new ways of food production, fertilizers, food technology, modified crops, new technologies to find oil reserves. This increases the Earth's carrying capacity, the largest number of people that the environment of a particular area can support. This is an important saying because it describes how after this rise of technology and industry, food supply would come after the growth of human population. In other words, the food supply depended on population size, unlike in Malthus's time where human population depended on food supply. The term Green Revolution refers to a series of research, development, and technological transfers that happened between the 1940s and the 1970s. The initiatives involved the development of high-yielding varieties of cereal grains. There were major advancements in both plant and animal breeding. Artificial insemination of livestock and genetically modified organisms, GMOs. Further down the food chain came innovations in food processing and distribution. The initiatives involved in expansion of irrigation infrastructure. Modernization of management techniques. Increased mechanization. Tractors with gasoline-powered internal combustion engines became the norm in the 1920s after Henry Ford developed his Fordson in 1917, the first mass-produced tractor. The distribution of hybridized seeds, synthetic fertilizers, and pesticides to farmers. Advances in fertilizers, herbicides, insecticides, fungicides, antibiotics, and growth hormones all led to better weed, insect, and disease control. All of these new technologies increased global agricultural production, with the full effect starting to be felt in the 1960s. And again, this is known as the Green Revolution, also known as the Third Agricultural Revolution. Cereal production, which are all of those grains that we use like wheat and corn and millet and sorghum, these are our main food sources, more than doubled in developing nations. Yields of rice, maize, wheat all increased steadily. Between 1950 and 1984, world grain production increased by over 250%, and the world added over 2 billion more people for dinner. The agricultural reforms and resulting production increases fostered by the Green Revolution are responsible for avoiding widespread famine in developing countries and for feeding billions more people since. The Green Revolution also helped kickstart the greatest explosion in human population in our history. It took only 40 years, starting in 1950, for the world population to double in size. But high food consumption has put pressure on the environment. Population growth and stress on the environment. Global population growth means that food production needs to increase by 70% by 2050, placing pressure on farms, soil, and food quality standards. In the developing world, where the population is expanding at an even faster rate, production needs to double, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN predicts. Developed regions like Europe will also need to increase their output in order to feed populations that are being boosted by longer lifespans and immigration. This population growth also puts stress on fish population and depletes oceans. We need to use the ocean. Food security and jobs depend on it. But we must be careful not to use it up. And right now, despite its vastness, we are indeed in danger of using it up. We are overfishing the ocean, killing fish faster than they can make babies. This puts a strain on not only the fish populations, but also the fishermen and the people who depend on these fish for food sources. "32% of the world's fish populations are overfished. And another 58% are fished to their maximum. Fishing provides work for 11% of the world's human population. Seafood accounts for 17% of the world's protein. In the US alone, the ocean economy employs more than 3 million people. More than farming, telecommunication, and construction combined. The scientific consensus is that to create a fully sustainable ocean, we need to fully protect at least 30% of it. Currently, the US protects 13.5% of its coastal waters. In recent times, the US has been a world leader in ocean policy and sustainably managed fisheries. That's thanks in part to the Magnuson-Stevens Act, which outlaws overfishing and requires the rebuilding of depleted fish populations. In 2017, Chile, Mexico, Micronesia, Haiti, Canada, Pakistan, and others declared new marine protected areas. Rapid population growth has increased the number of poor people in developing countries, thus contributing to the degradation of the environment and the renewable and non-renewable resources. Demands of the rich, industrialized, more developed countries have also generated environmental pressures and have been the foremost in the consumption of the so-called non-renewable resources: fossil fuels, metals, and minerals. Rapid population growth also destroys forests. We often get to hear that deforestation, which can be attributed to a wide range of human activities, including agriculture and logging, is to be blamed for several environmental issues. While destruction of forest cover can be attributed to natural processes such as volcanoes and landslides as well, their role in this destruction is easily overshadowed by the role played by humans. According to a report compiled by the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, approximately 80% of the deforestation in the world today is attributed to agriculture. Of the remaining 20%, roughly around 14% is attributed to logging, 5% to the use of firewood, and remaining is utilized for other purposes. All of these human activities, which are considered to be causes of deforestation, invariably rise with the rise in population. For instance, population growth is directly related to increase in the demand for food. In order to meet this demand for food, we have to produce more crops. And to get more land for cultivation, we have started encroaching upon the forest land, cutting down trees and turning vast tracts of lush green forests into large fields. Water may seem abundant, but less than 1% of the world's water can be used for human needs. Stress on freshwater resources due to rising demand is already leading to water scarcity in many places. Approximately 2 billion people are currently living in areas faced with water stress or scarcity. Water scarcity affects all social and economic sectors and threatens the health of ecosystems. How much water does it take to produce the Big Mac sandwich a customer buys? It takes 995 gallons of water to produce one Big Mac. Take a second and watch this video. How many gallons of water were used to make Don Gorski's 30,000 Big Macs? 29,850,000 gallons of water. To deliver 1 gallon of milk to your grocery store requires 880 gallons of water. That includes water for raising and grazing cattle and bottling and processing. 1 pound of chocolate requires 3,170 gallons of water. Population growth limits the amount of water available per person, drives people into marginal regions which are already water stressed, and also into cities. For instance, most of the countries in the Middle East and North Africa region cannot meet their current water demand. 7 of the world's 10 water-scarce countries are in the Middle East, North Africa region. The world's population has grown 4-fold. The world's use of fresh water supplies has grown 8-fold. Rapid population growth can also increase diseases. The first World Health Day was celebrated in 1950, back when world population was only 2.5 billion. Let's take a moment and consider some of the ways population growth has impacted the ability of diseases to spread. Population density and urbanization. Diseases spread more quickly among people who live in close proximity to each other. Currently, over 50% of the global population lives in urban areas. With more people living in dense conditions, there is more frequent contact between more individuals. Migration and global travel. As it becomes more common for people to travel throughout the world, it also becomes easier for diseases to travel with them. An outbreak in one region that would have been otherwise contained can move into other uninfected regions when infected people travel or relocate to these areas. As a result, epidemics or pandemics happen or are more possible. An epidemic is when a disease affects just one region. A pandemic is when it affects the world. In mid-April of 2009, samples from 2 California children suffering from the flu arrived at the CDC in Atlanta for further investigation. Something didn't seem normal about the particular flu strain they had. Local clinics and flu surveillance staff had detected a virus that had a unique genetic makeup, different from any known human flu virus. It was entirely new to science. That was the beginning of the 2009 swine flu pandemic. And most of these new viruses are what we call zoonotic viruses, meaning that they transfer from animals to humans, just like with the coronavirus that we're dealing with right now. Countries around the world took notice and prepared for possible outbreaks. The World Health Organization sent out guidelines to ministries of health, and vaccines were developed in a matter of months. The virus, which may have started infected people first in Mexico, spread across the globe, infecting millions of people and killing thousands. before running its course with the pandemic coming to an end in August of 2010. The virus was a new strain of H1N1, the influenza virus involved in the devastating 1918 Spanish flu pandemic, which killed between 30 million to 150 million people worldwide. The emergence of the new H1N1 in 2009 was a reminder that despite the unprecedented progress in treating infectious disease in the past decades, the looming shadow of a deadly pandemic still persists. In fact, with every mysterious virus that surfaces, be it the 2009 swine flu, the 2002 SARS coronavirus, or more recently MERS, a viral respiratory illness that has emerged around the Arabian Peninsula and killed half of the people who have had it. The same questions come to the mind of researchers and health authorities. Is this the virus that's going to cause the next pandemic? And now, new challenges such as rapid population growth are being added to existing ones. The sheer number of people, their interactions with animals and ecosystems, and the increase in international trade and travel are all factors that will likely change the way humanity deals with preventing and treating epidemics and pandemics. There's a strong correlation between the risk of pandemic and human population density. We've done the math and we've proved it. Infant child mortality is high in developing areas. The death of an infant will lead to a cessation of breastfeeding, meaning that the mother is able to fall pregnant again sooner than if the child had survived. Further, if a large family size is desired for cultural or economic reasons, parents may take into account high levels of mortality by having more children in order to ensure that they reach their desired family size. In 2013, the number of children dying in childhood was down to 3.7 million. Big countries like Brazil and China have reduced their child mortality rates tenfold over the last 4 decades. Other countries, especially in Africa, still have high child mortality rates, but it's not true that these countries are not making progress. In sub-Saharan Africa, child mortality has been continuously falling for the last 50 years. The study of population is really about women, specifically the status of women. Population control and reduction responsibilities have fallen largely on women. Why? Because low status of women means fewer rights. The role and status of women around the world is very closely tied to fertility rates and ultimately population growth trends. Universal education and gender equity are both very important topics to consider when discussing the link between fertility trends and women. Progress towards gender equity is hampered by long-held traditions that define women's role narrowly as child-bearers and unpaid workers in the home and fields. This is especially true in many of the less developed countries, where the cycle of discrimination against women begins with the treatment of girls. Some societies limit girls' access to formal education, thereby limiting future employment and economic freedom. Girls' education often ends with an early marriage. 6 of the 10 countries with the highest rates of child marriage are in West and Central Africa, also the places that have the highest population growth. Investments in women's education have proven especially effective at lowering fertility rates, since better educated women tend to marry later and have fewer children. Studies on every continent show that as literacy rates rise, especially those of women, income levels, nutrition levels, and child survival rates rise as well. A study using data from 219 countries from 1970 to 2009 found that for every 1 additional year of education for women of reproductive age, child mortality decreased by 9.5%. Women have historically had fewer opportunities in the policy-making bodies, and change has been slow. In 2015, women comprised just 1/5 of legislators worldwide and only 7% of heads of state. Some countries have only recently granted women the right to vote, including Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. When women have greater participation in policymaking, they can more effectively advocate for policies that advance women's status and childcare, both essential for healthy, sustainable societies. Bottom line, there is an inverse relationship between education level of women and population growth. In most parts of the world, why are women having fewer children? In 2008, 39% of German women had reached the age of 40 without having a child, and that's because women are pursuing other things outside of the home. They're getting married later. They're delaying childbirth. As countries become more developed, there's a much higher cost for raising children. Urbanization means less space. The status of women, higher education levels, and higher economic status are all reasons why globally women are choosing to have fewer children. So big picture, guys. World population is still growing, but as women become more educated, we are seeing that growth rate slow down globally. The end.